Hey, what I learned today, number 7. Today we're continuing the conversation about the explosion diagram of art. Started this in number 4. I described a little bit about what my concept of the explosion diagram of art is. We started talking about how to practice lines, and in the last video, we started talking about how to practice shapes. We talked a little bit about circles. I think this video, I'm going to briefly cover squares. Squares are kind of a continuation of practicing lines, and you could maybe transfer into, practicing squares instead of practicing lines. And then I'll talk a little bit about practicing shapes or practicing forms. Forms are the next step in this process, where we use line as the fundamental base. Lines help us build shapes. Shapes help us build convincing forms. And then we move into perspective and value. And these all stack and work together. It's always a good idea to keep this sharp, and especially for beginners, training the hand confidence. That's what this is all about, is training hand confidence. And that benefits you in drawing and painting. Anything that you do, you're putting images down on a piece of paper or a canvas or a tablet, whatever, can all be broken down into these basics, and separating them into individual units that we can focus on individually will really help us bring them all together into a cohesive, unified structure. We talked a bit about practicing lines, the horizontal, the vertical, the diagonal, the different ways that we can practice those. You can stack two things together here, where you're still practicing the lines, but maybe you're starting to now put them together into the shape of cubes. And just as with lines, you wanted some consistency. Try aiming for some consistency in the cubes that you draw. The size of the cubes can vary. Just do a few of each. Rotate them in space, or rotate them on your paper. Now you're practicing the diagonals. Practice the different directions that you can make the lines to make the cubes, etc. Basically, all the different ways that you practice the lines, do the same thing, but just start creating cubes or squares. The main gist of this video, though, I want to start talking about form. That's the next step up from shape. Forms are shapes solidified in 3 dimensions. This is the first tentative step into, real world application, where these things move from an abstract concept into something, really tangible and applicable to constructing more and more complex forms. And it can be really as simple as what you've been practicing before, but just adding in a couple of extra lines. So let's say you're practicing drawing cubes. Well, you can draw a cube somewhere up and to the left of that, connect with lines. I keep saying cube. You can practice drawing some squares, connect with lines, and now you have a 3-dimensional cube. The consistency can vary a little bit as well. Like maybe you want to draw a slightly bigger cube up and next to the first one. Your connecting lines now start creating something that's in perspective. Maybe the width of your cubes are changing a little bit, and when you connect those lines together, the perspective of the cube has changed. Now we're starting to see that, this face here is now starting to turn a little bit more towards us. We're faking perspective We're faking perspective here. In the coming video, I'll talk a little bit deeper about perspective, and the argument could be made that a lesson in perspective should come first before 3-dimensional forms. And I wouldn't necessarily argue against that. I just think that there's something to be said for playing with these shapes without the more rigorous, complex aspects of perspective kind of clouding the experience that you have of just practicing playing with the raw shapes themselves, if that makes sense. So just as we're playing there with the squares, oh, and by the way, it doesn't always have to go up and to the left. You know, maybe you go down and to the left, up and to the left. Oh, saying, here I am trying to teach people, and I don't have my left and my right mixed up. So just take everything I've set up until this point and switch it. Anyway, start in the other direction if you want to as well. Now we're starting to see how two-dimensional shapes are extruding into 3 dimensions. Just as you were practicing circles in rows like this, maybe start stacking circles offset from those, connect them with a couple of lines, and you've made a cylinder. If you're working with a larger and a smaller one, when you connect those two, you now have a cylinder that's moving in perspective. It's not correct perspective. If a cylinder was actually pointed in this direction, you know, this circle would have a different face to it. But again, we're just starting to get a flavor for the effect of depth and dimension. You can start practicing different shaped ellipses too, you know, where a circle is transferring from a straight-on face to something that has a little bit more of a slimmer profile. And you can practice with those. And you get all kinds of different, and you now here, this is a tapering cylinder. Experiment, try different things out. But if you decide to start experimenting with how your shapes are going to go together, try and do a few of them in a row and try and get some consistency between them. So you're not just doing this, then you're doing something different, then you're doing something different. Do one thing and repeat that a couple of times to really start driving in the muscle memory. For a little extra credit, as an added bonus, look around your house for things that have roughly cube shapes or roughly cylinder shapes. Put them down on your desk, maybe even prop them up on each other, and make little still lifes for yourself of cubes and cylinders so that when you're observing how this 3-dimensional shape is laying on the table in space, you're using that to see, here's this circle. Circle looks a little bit like this. What is the angle of this side of the cylinder that I see? It goes a little bit like this, and the other angle matches that. And then I see the other side curving away. And then tilt it a little bit. You don't have to be holding it. I have a curved surface or I have a slanted surface in front of me, so if I set this down, it would just be rolling. So I'm just holding it just for the sake of demonstration. But when you're doing this, set it flat on the table in front of you. And like I said, prop it up on something that is vaguely cube shape, or practice these individually just by themselves. And same thing with the cube. Rotate it in space. Move it around. Pause it in one position. Try and draw a faithful representation of the shapes as you see them. Move it and place it in a different position and do the same thing. Now we're getting a couple of things here. We're starting to practice from life, which is an incredibly important skill to be practicing. Just what you see in front of you, and drawing what you see in front of you doesn't have to be particularly elaborate. You see still life sometimes, and it's flowers and vases and plaster casts of fancy things, and that's all well and good, but it can really just be as simple as old boxes that you have. Prop them up in different positions and start getting a feel for how those objects move and turn in space. And again, even for the most advanced artists, it's always good to go back to this for a refresher. These kinds of practices and these kinds of studies have value throughout the progress of your artistic journey. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments, and I really appreciate your time. See you in the next one.